Good morning. Welcome to this edition of the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known on this Tuesday, February 8th, 2022. It's Breonna Taylor all over again. The police shooting and killing of 22-year-old Amir Locke during a no-knock warrant again has Black America demanding police reform and chanting, "No justice, no peace." Amir was resting on his couch, on a neighbor's couch or a friend's couch, from what we understand, when police barged into his home. He had a gun and certainly sought to defend himself. Well, how do we know this? Police say he wasn't the subject of the warrant, and apparently they were at the wrong house. Still, authorities seem to be defending the actions of the officers and laying the blame on Amir, who by all accounts thus far was the victim who had no prior beefs with law enforcement. The warrant was issued in relation to a homicide probe led by detectives from the neighboring St. Paul Police Department. Locke was not named in the warrant, and Minneapolis police have acknowledged it was unclear how or whether he was connected to that investigation. We discussed No Knock Warrants this morning with Let It Be Known's Chief Legal Analyst Robert Tarver of the Tarver Law Firm and Patrice Sultan of the DC JusticeLAB. But first, let's bring on the president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis Jr., and the publisher of the West Side Gazette, Bobby Henry. Good morning.
Good morning, Stacey Brown, and good morning, Bobby Henry. So good to see you.
You know, Dr. Chavis, it's always good to see you, and good morning to Stacey and everybody.
Well, the Black press is on point in Minneapolis, as we are in 230 other places around the United States that make up the National Newspaper Publishers Association. So pleased that Bobby Henry, he's our man in South Florida, the West Side Gazette. So no knock warrants, systemic racism in the so-called criminal justice system and police departments and judicial and prosecutorial still goes on, you know, and how many more tragedies have to happen before these racist, racial discriminatory, racially oppressive laws are taken off the books. We got a lot of work to do. It's 2022. We don't need no more wake-up calls. This is not about staying awake or staying woke. This is about pressing forward and demanding freedom, justice, and equality, not only for Black people, but for all people.
Yes.
Well, let's start with the news headlines this morning. First Lady Jill Biden said yesterday that she was disappointed one of her key causes, free community college, was cut from President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. The president's Build Back Better plan has faced an uphill battle inside Congress, involving intense negotiations after receiving significant pushback from key Senate Democrats, notably Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kirsten Sinema of Arizona. The original Build Back Better bill included $45.5 billion for states to offer 2 years of free community college tuition for a period of 5 years. However, in a news conference, President Biden told reporters he was worried that component of his spending plan would not make the final cut. The admission Monday by the First Lady in her remarks to the assembled community, I should say, of college leaders was the first time she had confirmed that agenda item was dead. She compared Washington political jockeying to sporting events, noting that the back and forth on Capitol Hill, while expected, can take for granted an administration's larger social agenda. The First Lady said, too often we treat what happens in our nation's capital like a sports game, too, wondering which team will score the most points with voters. Legislation becomes a football to keep away from the other side, and Americans get lost in the playbook. So, you know, profound words, of course, from the First Lady. And so we see that Build Back Better, if it's to go forward, Bobby Henry and Dr. Chavis, it's going to be without free community college.
You know, it's I guess appropriate that First Lady would use the analogy of sports, especially football, with the climate that's happening right now with Brian Flores, all of the racism. So that in itself is an indicator to what we are experiencing. And I, for one, will never believe that when education is involved, the true aspect of education, that we would get a fair shake at this. You know, with that CRT happening and just the truth being told. and systemic racism is at an all-time high. When it comes to education, every chance I do believe that those two individuals that were mentioned, the undercover Republicans posing as Democrats, when anything come up in that nature, I don't see them voting for it, period. So,
you know, we are going to see what happens as this continues to move forward. Also in the news this morning, don't call it a comeback. Kwame Kilpatrick, the former Detroit mayor who was convicted and sentenced to years in prison for federal corruption, has started a new business. Despite having been released from prison, Kilpatrick reportedly still owes the city of Detroit and the IRS more than $4.7 million. He says his new venture is called Movemental Ministries and will include Saturday services, Bible studies, and workshops. Kwame says it's a virtual ministry, so we'll be everywhere. Kilpatrick said about his recent venture, which started from prison when he got an idea from a book he was reading at the time. Kilpatrick was sentenced to 28 years in prison after being convicted of 24 federal felony counts. He only served about 7 years of his sentence because he was given a pardon and early release. So Kwame Kilpatrick is back in the spotlight, Dr. Chavis.
Well, yes, and we wish him well. We believe in second chances. We believe in third chances. Who are we to stand in judgment of one another? And I think this brother can come back with redemption. And he's talking about particular things that affect the quality of life in our community. I think that not only Detroit should welcome him back, but America should welcome him back. We should never try to discard or pretend that redemption is not always available to everyone. So, you know, if you get knocked down, you get up and you try to get up stronger.
You know, and this is, again, let me just jump in and say this. This is the power of HBCUs. You know, his blood is orange and green. He's a rattler. You know, so I mean, if to speak on the need for our HBCUs and the significance of them, the fact that we can, Dr. Chavis, be knocked down and get up, you know, and come back. So,
absolutely.
Also, Bobby Henry in the news this morning out of Florida. The school system in Florida's most populous county includes students whose families moved there from 160 nations. Its expansive cultural mix is represented in the district's curriculum, which includes not only American history, but also the stories of violent government upheavals, such as the revolution of enslaved people who founded Haiti and the more recent political trauma of protesters who fled or perished in Castro's Cuba. Florida lawmakers are considering legislation that would police what students are taught, leaving many to wonder if educators and students will still be able to discuss how some of their ancestors arrived in the United States. The new law would make it nearly impossible to teach slavery, the slave trade, or even about the Holocaust. As part of the quote unquote stop woke agenda of Governor Ron DeSantis, the Republican in Florida, lawmakers are now considering bills that would allow almost anyone to object to any instruction in public school classrooms. DeSantis wants to give people the right to sue schools and teachers over what they teach based on quote unquote student discomfort. So, Bobby, the governor out there he's at it again.
Man, the governor, DeSantis. I just right before the show came on, one of our state representatives texted me and showed me a hit list that had 23 counties on there that they were taking monies from, and this is a part of the education thing. Again, Stacey and Dr. Chavis and those who are listening, let us please understand that the truth. People want to suppress the truth, and in the education arena, that's the final place that you can do this. You know, you're putting cameras in the classroom. You don't want the truth to be told. I just recently turned down a speaking engagement at Fort Lauderdale High, which is one of the prominent schools in Fort Lauderdale, because they wanted to look at my speech and censor my speech and not allow me to tell the truth. So I couldn't go in there. And it's a doggone shame when a governor or anybody would want to suppress the true form of education in all of its reality. When you want to ban books and not have the truth of a people being taught to children to carry this truth on, it's a damn shame, excuse me. But that's what we're up against.
Absolutely. Elections have consequences. And governors like DeSantis in Florida, the governor of Texas, the governor of Georgia, the governor of Mississippi, the governor of Alabama, all these people need to be voted out of office. And you know what? Black people have the power. Latino people have the power to vote these people out of office. So it's one thing to complain about what they're doing, but when we have an opportunity to push these people out of our way, out of our pathway, and Bob is right, that we need to transfer our outrage into the proactive voting power to change at the county level, at the regional, congressional level, and at the state level, as well as the national. Right now, apartheid is being driven at the state level. Let me say that again. American apartheid has been driven at the state level. But I'm going to go back about this education. Stacey, you led about them taking free community education out of the bill, the Build Back Better bill. Well, in Cuba, you not only have free community college, you have free college, you have free graduate school, you have free medical school, you have free law school. That's Cuba. So while people criticize Cuba, why is it that a small island nation can offer free education to all of its inhabitants, to all of its residents? And a few miles across the water in Florida, you have a government that not only wants to deny free community college, but for those who can get to a high school or a junior high school or even an elementary school or even a pre-K, they don't want the truth told. I mean, it is glaringly obvious that the sin of racism, the sin of white supremacy, is not only going to affect communities of color, it's also going to affect us white children. No one is born a racist, but right now we have institutionalized ignorance at the governor level and at the state legislative level. Institutionalized ignorance.
Yeah, we're gonna let that sit right there for today. We're gonna pick that conversation up for certain, Dr. Chavis. But under the cover of complete darkness, police officers dressed mostly in black or dark tactical gear and armed with military-grade weapons, they smash in a door of a private residence and charge in, guns ablazing. The homeowner wakes from his sleep, scared to death, and naturally believing that police are burglars who wish to harm their families. The homeowner occupant grab a weapon. Sometimes they fire on police. Other times police fire first. Someone usually ends up wounded or dead. So why do judges still grant no-knock warrants? Let's talk about it with Let It Be Known Chief Legal Analyst Robert Tarver of the Tarver Law Firm in New Jersey and Patrice Sultan of the DC JusticeLAB. Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, Patrice, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll throw it to our legal mind over there. But why do judges still grant no-knock warrants?
Well, judges are following the statutes that legislatures put in place. We have a constitution that the Supreme Court decides every now and then with this constitutional floor because our state governments refuse to regulate what police can and cannot do. They have tremendous power and authority to say that warrants will not issue under certain circumstances, not just with respect to whether a person knocks or not before they enter, not just with respect to whether search warrants can occur at night, but also with respect to whether search warrants can issue at all. There's really no practical reason that we should be allowing police to conduct home invasions looking for things like possessory offenses, looking for things like drugs, looking for things like currency. If they're looking for an active shooter or a missing child, that's a very different scenario. But the vast majority of the thousands and thousands of search warrants that we see in DC every year are looking for things like drug activity. And that is our local council's responsibility to set a higher floor for what judges are required to do when police apply for a search warrant. And I'll also note that DC is unusual because police have to go through our local prosecutor, which is the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, before they get to a judge. And a lot of states have not taken that step yet.
Yeah, I should note too, before we go to Attorney Tarver, that Patrice is also an attorney too. So we got two great legal minds with us. But Attorney Tarver, I'm going to throw it over to you. This continues to happen, and most times the victims are African American.
Sure, because generally when you're talking about these no-knock warrants, you're generally involved in matters that deal with narcotics, finance for narcotics, and things of that nature. Fourth Amendment says that persons in America are supposed to be free and secure from unreasonable searches. The question is, what is a no-knock search, or who is it reasonable for? And what we've done is we've changed the paradigm and said, let's make it important to determine what's unreasonable for the police as opposed to reasonable for the citizen. And what a no-knock warrant is supposed to do is supposed to protect police interests so that they can storm into a home without alerting someone to their presence so that they can get a weapon. But what it does is it ignores the very safety that the Constitution actually allows for individuals. 30 years ago, I was a prosecutor running the narcotics strike force. We ran down to Miami in order to be able to investigate a number of things that they did with no-knock warrants, and they showed how they execute no-knock warrants. I came back to New Jersey and I said, we're not doing this, because I recognize that there are people that could just be hurt by this same procedure. When someone breaks into your home in the middle of the night, you don't know who it is. And that's what happened here with Amir Locke.
Yeah, and Patrice, shouldn't it concern lawmakers and judges and even officers that these no-knock warrants does little to assure safety for officers and the victims or the individuals that they are serving these warrants on?
I think there is a recognition that it's terrifying and traumatizing for the people who are present at the time a raid happens. We spoke with, through our Police Reform Commission, a number of officers from the Metropolitan Police Department here. And they said that one of them said that she would probably pass out from fear if a search warrant was executed on her home. And it was frustrating and alarming to hear that kind of description, followed by their explanation of how they decide whether to seek a warrant or not, which had nothing to do with whether or not it would cause more harm than it would help. And the fact that that kind of discernment is completely absent from policing and prosecution is a problem. When the only questions being asked are, do we have enough cause to believe that somebody committed a drug offense? And that's your standard for whether or not you put officers in harm's way, you put the people in the home in harm's way. It's really, really a dangerous situation. And I think that what we're learning is that even the officers who are having a very good time doing this and going out and having fun with these raids, really have a different presumption of dangerousness when they encounter a Black person in a home than when they encounter a white person. If you look at this photograph of officers arresting the person who was accused of shooting 2 police officers in Bridgewater, that's an incredible photograph, that this person is arrested for something like that, unharmed, unscathed. And for some reason, the moment that there's even an allegation of gun possession by a Black person, it's considered a crime of violence or a dangerous crime when it's a possessory offense. When white people engage in it, it's considered more dangerous than a white person who just killed, as far as they knew, 2 officers. I mean, it's just a completely different standard of evidence that's being applied across the board.
Yeah, Patrice used the terminology. She said the officers basically have fun with it or what have you. And you think about this, Attorney Tarver, trial is going on right now. And one of the officers in the Breonna Taylor matter, he shot into a neighboring apartment. That's what he's being charged with, not the Breonna Taylor murder, but he's being charged with shooting wildly into the next door neighbor's apartment. So that phraseology there of having fun. It seems like they go in there. It's like a sport to them.
Yeah. Well, there are whole institutions built up behind police weaponry, behind police SWAT and things of that nature, and they're gonna exercise what they can when they can. But we're not looking at some of the real victims here. Not victims, I should say, the real villains here. And one of the biggest villains here is the judge. These warrants don't get executed. They don't get sent out unless a judge says that I believe there is probable cause to allow for a no-knock warrant, for you to be able to go in and just not bust a door in without any notion of warning. And so realistically, I agree with Patrice 100%. But we also need to look at the police officers, because they are the ones who ultimately will get the chance to say, no, this is not a scenario where you should just bust into a home. And ironically, in the Amir Locke case, it is the same judge that presided over the Chauvin trial that issued this particular warrant. So on one hand, he giveth and then he taketh away very clearly. But you look at this video, and this is the scenario that we as people of color face every day. It is one in which our very humanity is demeaned. Our very standing under the Constitution is demeaned, because we do not have the same right and standing as white Americans when it comes to policing. The fact of the matter is, you don't see these types of things happening in the white community with the frequency that they happen in the black community. And just because people are not shot on a regular basis and firearms are not discharged on a regular basis, you've got to understand, no-knock warrants are issued with regularity in most jurisdictions where there are people of color, certainly in most urban jurisdictions. And it has become the standard because police officers' safety, so to speak, has now trumped the ability of individuals to be safe in their own homes.
Yeah, Patrice, let's talk about the Castle Doctrine, which has been adopted in nearly all 50 states and authorizes a person attacked in his home to use force without retreating. So when you have that, and the Amir Locke situation, he didn't fire his weapon, but he did have a weapon. But he had every right to have that weapon. He had every right to defend himself. He didn't know that these were not just simple intruders, right?
Well, the Castle Doctrine is different in different states and has a really interesting history. But I think that the sort of underlying philosophy or in those moral instincts that are part of the beginnings of that doctrine are still very much part of human instinct today. And the idea that a person should be safe in their own castle and allowed to defend their own home is something that resonates with the majority of folks in this country, even though the states are a lot more split now than they were many years ago. The sort of actions of the person who's there, aren't even what's being debated when we're talking about the way that these things play out. Because what we know is for a fact is that the police are so heavily armed that if you try to meet them with any kind of threat, it's not going to play out for the person who's in their home. It's much different than reacting to a burglar or a home invasion.
Yeah, it just seems that another important principle that the underlying the knock and announce requirement is that the suspect should be given the opportunity to voluntarily comply with the law. The principle is rooted in the presumption of innocence, one of the hallmarks of our legal system.
Yeah, but Stacey, let's be realistic. What we really have here, you have to look at two constitutional amendments. The Second Amendment, which allows for individuals to be able to have firearms and has been expanded in a number of states. And the Fourth Amendment, which allows you to be safe in your home. And if you look at it, both of those amendments are meeting in this particular instance. And both of them have been diminished when it comes to African Americans. Sure, you can have a Second Amendment right to have a firearm, but unlike others, your Second Amendment right is diminished when it comes to that Fourth Amendment right for them to bust into your home. Sure, you could be safe in your home, but it's diminished when they say that they can get a no-knock warrant. And in each of those diminutions, it applies, unfortunately, to people of color. We are the ones whose rights are being diminished on a regular and routine basis.
Well, and it's true, right, Patrice? We don't see SWAT teams going into white collar communities, right?
Part of the reason for that, is, at least in Washington, D.C., is
I think we are losing.
I think
for
you may have
a
lost her.
warrant.
Oh, there she is.
Sorry about that. I was saying that a lot of the warrants issued in Washington, D.C. are based on traffic stops and street encounters. And so the more you're stopping and frisking Black people, the more search warrants for homes we see for Black people as a result.
Yeah, and Attorney Tarver, same question. I want to get your in New Jersey. You don't see that in New Jersey, do you?
Yeah, not at all. And I got to tell you, I practice all over the United States. And the fact of the matter is, you will find higher levels of drugs being moved in some of these other neighborhoods than you will find in urban communities where Black people proliferate. And yet, there is a whole different standard for how you approach individuals who are in a different social strata, who are of a different race, and who are of a different social class. Quite frankly, if we're real about it, and if we're honest about it, if we're truthful about it, what we've allowed in this country, and it's true not just in the criminal justice system, but in all areas, is a deterioration of the constitutional rights of people of color. And it's reflected everywhere, including the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and as James Wright of the Washington Informer, he writes in, let's make it plain, no knock warrants are instruments of terror against Blacks like battering rams and chokeholds. No knock warrants should be outlawed, he says. And David Youngblood says, no knock warrants have a long history of being a failed policy. It gets citizens and officers killed. And, to close it all out to both of you, isn't that just a fact that it gets not just the civilians killed, but in some cases gets officers killed?
A no-knock warrant says you have no rights which the police are bound to respect when it comes to the Fourth Amendment. That's really what it is. And you can't get around that. Unfortunately, it applies to us in such great numbers that you have to consider that it is racial in its imposition.
Yeah, without question. I know that the DC JusticeLAB, you guys have been doing a lot on this topic. Patrice, I want to give you some final thoughts on what the DC JusticeLAB, how does you guys view these no-knock warrants, and what do you propose?
Yeah, so we propose that the DC Council, which is our equivalent of a state government until we have statehood, limit the ability of judges to issue search warrants under certain circumstances, and that they limit the way that search warrants can be executed. I think a lot about that dispatcher who was talking to George Zimmerman and said, we don't need you to do that. Legislatures across the country have the ability to do the same thing, to tell judges, to tell police, to tell members of the executive that we don't need you to do that. And their refusal to do it is really just as problematic as the people who are engaging and taking advantage of that authority.
Patrice Sultan of the DC JusticeLAB and attorney Robert Tarver, we certainly appreciate this discussion this morning. We think that it's something that we know that it's something that we'll continue to talk about until something concretely is done. We didn't get a chance to get closing thoughts from Dr. Chavis this morning, but we thank, of course, Bobby Henry of the West Side Gazette, and always Dr. Chavis, our president and CEO. Thanks for joining Let It Be Known. We will see you tomorrow.